Jim had done a couple of sketches and designed the models for the first movie, and they were just sort of refined. It was originally going to be a lot more involved. So we were going to develop the war aspect in the future quite a bit, and that included coming up with original devices and machines, weapons that, while being original, were sort of like cut from the same cloth. There was an enlarged scale flying platform, like a, it had 4 engines as opposed to 2. It was sort of like a Stratofortress or a B-17 model of the flying craft. I did a mock-up of that out of cardboard, and of course they were never built. There was also the what we called the Centurion, which was sort of a 4-legged spidery device that would sort of run across the rubble with these big spiky feet, and it had a chassis up top that was a little bit like the tank. It didn't have a separate head, it just sort of had these 2 arms with these big cannons on them. The silverfish was sort of like a segmented flat trilobite or potato bug, about 8 or 10 feet long, and through some mysterious means this thing could drive across the rubble, and it's basically silverfish. It's silver, but it also ties into the fact that it's a torpedo. So it's basically designed to infiltrate gun emplacements or go underneath vehicles, whatever, and then explode. What you originally were going to see was all these machines kind of auger in and bite the bullet. The war is over, they've killed the computer, and then the team goes in. You see them descending into this mammoth pit that's all burning and sparking, damaged on this really weird elevator. And what they're doing is they're going down into the machine world, and they go down a long corridor into this chamber, and in the middle of the chamber are these 3 rings, metal rings about 10, 12 feet across, sort of nested inside each other like, the layers of an onion. And in the middle of that is a big hole in the floor, black. And somebody throws something in there, it's obviously very deep, you don't see what it is. And what they do is they put Reese into the middle of this device, and it's some kind of a magnetic field. He doesn't fall, he sort of floats there. The rings begin counter-revolving, and the room breaks into these 4 lobes, sort of they track out across what turns out to be the ceiling of this tremendously huge chamber. And the rings begin spinning so fast that he looks like a human atom. He descends into the center of this thing. Everyone up top is hiding behind these lead shields. There's a tremendous blast of energy, and he's gone. And so John Connor sent his dad back in time, and Jim wanted it to be really massive and very dramatic. So that was the idea there. That would sort of segue into these big doors opening like a big vault, and it's very cold, ice falling off, and the guys go in, and there's all these Terminators hanging there, and it's just a cold storage area. And when they arrive, there's one missing, which is presumably the first Terminator, and Connor looks at the second one and sort of remembers years ago, and then you sort of go into the present day. I thought it was pretty.
You mentioned the biker bar, and the first thing that comes to mind is the time that Arnold is sitting at the counter with his shorts on only, just a pair of jam shorts, because we were doing the scene where he was walking in supposedly naked. Well, we have a whole film crew in there, and we have all of our extras looking like bikers, and it really looked like a biker bar, except for a bunch of people running around looking like crew with lights and cameras and all that. A drunk woman happens to stumble in, gets through security, gets past all the assistant directors, and walks up and sits at the bar next to Arnold. And Arnold's just talking to somebody across the bar, and she sits there and she's looking around, not realizing anything's going on. And she looks over next to Arnold. She looks at him, doesn't recognize him. She goes, "What's going on here?" And Arnold looks at her. He says, "It's male stripper night." With that, 80s grabbed her and hauled her out of there.
We established early on that Cyberdyne was to be one of the colder sets because we're dealing with a robot with a metal structure. That was something that we wanted to in some way bring into the set as well. Some slick surfaces or reflective type surfaces. When we enter into the lab, visually very, very busy spaces with all the research and all the equipment and all the computers and the backs of stuff opening, and we place that inner guts, so to speak, just like all the inner surgery of the robot, in again a very slick and clean and machined, precise looking architectural envelope. Those were the thoughts behind that set, and then with all that in mind and the early selection of materials and making things acceptable to the city for the kinds of stunts and work that we were going to do and meeting their codes and guidelines, we were able to proceed pretty quickly with resolving that and getting it going. One of the things for us in the art department was to still try to think about a project that could still be visually interesting, again, 5 or 6 or 7 years down the road when somebody goes and rents it on a video, that somehow the look and everything in the show can still transcend that a little bit.
There's a lot of action in the picture, and my philosophy is any way that gets the shot done safely and gets the dynamics and the kinetic energy that the shot requires is the right way to do the shot. If it's rear projection with the actor, fine, do it that way. If we can throw a dummy off a cliff, then you do it that way, if it can look good. You can use blue screen optical compositing. You can use miniatures. All of these things can make it seem far more violent than it ever really was. It doesn't all have to be a stunt, but obviously there are times when it has to be a stunt. There has to be a driver in the car, or there has to be a man to take the fall, or whatever, and then it has to be incredibly well planned. We did a shot where we had Arnold's double, Peter Kent, riding a motorcycle out of a tunnel, and then there was a huge explosion behind him. Had to be very, very carefully calculated exactly where the blast from the explosion would go, how it was cued in such a way that it was fail-safe, that he couldn't get caught in the tunnel with the explosion going off. And we used long lenses to make it look like he was much closer to the shock front of the explosion than he really was. And all of these techniques all come into play to make it safe. And we did it twice, and there were no problems. In fact, we've had very good success rate with our complicated stunts. There's no reason to ever put an actor in jeopardy with the technology that's available to us now. Sometimes, actors want to do their own stunts, and it's actually not a good idea, because in the heat of the moment, you may want to get in there and do something, and then afterwards you realize it wasn't safe. So the trick is to know exactly when it's feasible and when it's not. Because it's also important to an audience to feel that their character is really there and that it's really happening. So as much as I can, I'll try to tie the actors into the action, but it always has to be done safely. There's always a line. And you can't go to a library and pick up a book and the book will say, if you're doing a motorcycle shot with Arnold Schwarzenegger on a Harley Davidson being towed by an insert car, this is exactly how fast you can go. Nobody can give you that information. It's a kind of a consensus knowledge. It's almost a folk knowledge, in a way, among film people. And you really have to rely on the best professional people. My 3 previous films have had a lot of action with explosions, fires, flooding, people underwater, car crashes. And I've never had anyone get injured. And that, to me, is the most important thing. To me, winning in this game is being able to get it up there on the screen and knock the audience out of their seats.
Oh yeah, the walk out of the fire. Well, that was actually very funny because that was the first big involvement with the computer graphic effects. And I remember because it's kind of funny because Jim had already warned me about my hair trigger and kind of you gotta I was so gung ho that I would kind of go in too far or try to do and he had said. Listen, I want you to run in there as far as you can, but as soon as it starts to get hot, you stop, turn around, find a mark, and then begin the walkout. And don't run in there too far, but get as close as you can. So I listened to him, but it went like in one ear and out the other, and I went, no, I've got to really do this for Jim and me and blah, 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 and for the movie. And it was the first big effects thing. And I ran in there, and I got in there so far, and I turned, and I stood there, and I hit the mark, and I got settled, and I got all in the T-1000 stance and everything. and the next thing I know, I could smell my shirt was burning, you know. I mean, it was like an iron. It smelled like an iron on a shirt, you know. And my ears were stinging, and I still haven't heard action. And you know, now the backs of my hands are really starting to sting, and I'm thinking, oh my God, at any moment I'm just going to ignite. He's gone. And so I think that was the first take where he said action. And man, as soon as he said action, I was like, phew, I was out of there. You know, I was walking, and I started walking even faster, and I'm walking even faster, and I finally just blew the whole take. And I remember Jim going, well, I told you don't have to go in there that far, you know. And I was like, I know. Oh, sorry about that. What we finally decided to do, they put all that heat retardant and stuff on the back of my ears because they do sort of attract things. And I ran in there with Pasha, my stand-in, and he held like one of those furniture blanket or something, but it was something that would kind of protect us from the heat. We'd stand there and wait until they got close and they're all set up to go, and we'd be on the mark, and I'd get all ready and into the stance and everything, and then Pasha would take the blanket and run out real quick, and then it was go, and then it was find the pace to match the computer. And that was a bitch of a shot. I think that took us like all day, and I'm sure that was a very expensive shot because, I mean, every take they had to reignite the fire and get that just right, and that was tough. It was a little freaky, because then I thought, God.
Aside from the other difficulties of scheduling a movie like this, one of the factors we had to consider was Eddie. We were going to be working with a minor. Eddie had no background in filmmaking. He was literally discovered in Pasadena by our casting director. And we had to, as you do with any child, educate him while he was on our set and under our care. And that turned out to be educate him in more ways than one. Eddie had lessons where we taught him how to ride the motorcycle. We gave him weightlifting and physical training stuff. We tried to supervise his diet. We hired a teacher welfare worker who was with us every day on the set and who not only took care of teaching Eddie in regular classroom studies on the set, but you know, dedicated her weekends and free time to taking Eddie on field trips, etc. Of course, while we're doing all this, we're training Eddie and he's having to go to school. You also have a limited number of hours that Eddie could be on the set. So X number of hours, 4 hours a day, he's in school, and you have to provide recreation time for any minor. And there are limitations as to how late that child can work. So needless to say that on top of all the other scheduling problems we had, working around a child actor who can't work past midnight, for example, and you're shooting a movie that basically takes place at night. One of the things you have to do on any production is, you know, to accommodate or think about what's the worst case scenario, because the cost of shooting a film once you get a film company together and have all these crew people on and the equipment on is extremely expensive. So your goal is that once you're up and running, you keep up and running until you finish shooting. On Terminator 2, the entire shooting schedule was skewed around the effects, the delivery schedule, and the throughput. And of course today things have changed a great deal, but when we first started doing the film, the throughput on some of the computer graphics was 5 or 6 months, and we didn't actually know what the outcome of some of those of our experiments in that area might be. So in some cases we were actually planning the look of a shot, what the location would look like, what the walls and the floor of a particular set would look like, prior to actually having the location locked in. I think one example of that is in the scene where the guard morphs up out of the floor in the hospital, and that we decided that the floor would be black and white tiles. Only when we finally chose our practical location, we didn't have black and white tiles, and we had to actually paint.
There was only ever one idea. About a year after the first picture was released, I was at a party at Arnold's house, and he asked me about doing a sequel for the picture, and I said, well, I have this kind of wacky idea to do 2 Terminators, a good and an evil Terminator. And at that time, I wanted him to play both of them. and the evil one would get more destroyed and would turn into the kind of the chrome skull death figure earlier in the story than it did in the first film, and the good one would stay more human looking for longer, and it would have been reprogrammed to be the protector of the child. So in a way, it was sort of dueling Terminators, and I got the idea to do a kind of a Shane story where it becomes a kind of surrogate father-son thing, and then of course it has to end tragically. And I told him that idea, and he really liked the idea a lot. And it kind of lay fallow for many years because the rights were all tied up, and there was a bunch of legal hoo-ha going on, and we never really got around to it. He was busy turning himself into an international megastar, and I was doing other things, and so when we finally came, full circle back to do Terminator 2, I basically went ahead with that, but I took out the kind of the two Arnold concept because I figured that I wanted to create a jeopardy that was greater than equal. I wanted the Terminator, the good Terminator, to be the central focus of the story, and I wanted him to be, in a sense, the underdog. So I had to create something which was as scary to the Terminator as the Terminator was to Reese and Sarah in the first film. And so
every aspect of the film was done quickly. The whole film was done in a year. A film of this size, it's amazing. Sound-wise, we pre-mixed in 2 weeks, 14 days, and we final mixed in 14 days. We would really, in the old days, want about 3 or 4 times as much time as that. We literally did one reel. The film broke down into 14 small reels, one reel each day. And we eventually got to the end keeping to that pace. The problem with a tight schedule like that is that you never go back to make changes. We never had time to screen the film, to look at it, to second guess ourselves, go back to an earlier reel and make changes. We just kept going along. In fact, the usual process is that you pre-mix, then final mix, and then print master, in which you put the mix in a form that it's going to end up in the theaters. But we were overlapping everything. The pre-mixing continued with different mixers while we started the final mix. As we started the final mix, parallel to that in another theater, another mixer was doing the print mastering because we had no time to get this out into theaters. So we couldn't go back and make changes. That's good and bad because I've been on a lot of mixes where we put the same reel up at least a dozen different times and tweak with it, and after a while you're getting no gain whatsoever.
you do have to take a certain moralistic stance. I mean, one of the decisions I made before I started the picture was that I was never going to have Eddie Furlong or John Connor point a gun at anybody. In the extended version, we see him cleaning guns, and he clearly knows how to do it. But I never wanted that image on the screen of a 12-year-old kid pointing a gun at somebody. That was just a decision that I made. Somehow I would have to work the plot where that never happened, no matter what the jeopardy or what the justification for it was. And frankly, I've seen lots of other films that don't take that moralistic stance. So here, you have a film that's a very violent film that a lot of people won't even go to see because they say, "Oh, I don't go to see movies like that," and yet wrapped within it is quite a strong moral stance that is very consistently applied throughout the whole movie, and that wasn't overlooked. I mean, a lot of people who wrote about the film talked about that, but it's a little bit of a mixed message in a sense, and I guess part of what's being said there is that you want peace, great. You don't get peace by turning your back on it and saying, "I don't like guns. I don't like violence." You earn peace. It's that simple. It really is.
It's in your nature to destroy yourselves.
The first step is to accept that it's an integral part of our nature to be violent and to address it and deal with it in the way that any illness is dealt with. I mean, our violent and aggressive nature is probably responsible for our success on this planet equally with our intelligence. It's allowed us to dominate this planet and spread, and there's no corner of our world that we don't control. But the price that we have to pay is that we always hover on that edge of annihilation. And a theme of this film is that it's something that's both an integral part of our nature, but that there's a hopeful message in this film that it's something we can deal with. This has been true of Aliens, The Abyss very much so. as kind of an exploration of human psychology as much as anything. And the fact that on the one hand we have all of these wonderful capacities, and on the other hand we have all these horrible capacities, and they coexist simultaneously in the same people. And what do you do about that? Do you write?
The placement of music in the film is at least equal to what the music is, and where you have the music and where you don't put music, and whether it's big music or small music is really essential, and those choices are as much part of the creative process as the actual writing of the melody and the choosing of the orchestration. The placement, which we call spotting, going back to process, we call that spotting the film. I sit with the director and we talk through the film and we have a spotting session, and that spotting session is to choose the spots where the music goes. And I think it's one of the most crucial parts of the process, and I change it all the time. We decide and then it changes, but still there are films where they don't put music on dialogue scenes. That's a completely comprehensive choice. We're not going to do dramatic underscore to the dialogue scenes, or we are going to do a classic, almost old-fashioned underlining of the dialogue scenes. You could see the same movie with a dialogue scene scored and without, and it'll be a different film. One would feel sort of gritty and contemporary, and the other one might feel a little more classic. Gary Summers was the gentleman who sat on a board much bigger than this, but at a given moment in the film, he's got my 6 music tracks, and it might be left, center, and right percussion, left, center, and right sustains and orchestral sounds, and he's actually working and trying to get the music to help the scene. If there's a moment of dialogue and the music's a little loud, hopefully so the audience doesn't notice it, he's pulling the music back, and then the dialogue's over and he'll push it through. And he does all this manipulation that you don't hear. The score, in my opinion, is finally, in a sense, created on the dubbing stage, because if I create a piece of music and that music is played too loud, everyone thinks the composer always wants the music loud, but if a piece of music that's meant to be supportive is played too loud, then everyone thinks, oh, the composer really botched that scene. He really stepped all over the scene. The music was played at the wrong level in many cases. Sometimes if a piece of music needs to be powerful and it's played too low, then people will feel like, boy, the composer didn't really add much energy to that scene. The difference between 6 decibels can make the difference of whether a cue works in a scene or not. The soundtrack album is sort of a great vanity moment for the composer, because it's the time where I get to present the music not in competition, even with a visual. I mean, certainly not with the sound effects, because that's the toughest thing. If a score is well designed, it should meld really well with the sound effects, and I feel that was part of the success of the Terminator scores, was I really took into account the sound effects and created things that sort of bridged between music and sound effects. But still, it's an opportunity for the listening audience to really hear what you did very clearly. So therefore, what we did was, when I was done with the score and had delivered and took a little bit of a break, I put up the tracks again and I really listened and based my mixes on what I felt was the most complete experience of the music as an element by itself. So of course things shifted, because I didn't quite have to be concerned about a given moment hurting the dialogue. So there might have been moments where I held back, where in my mix I could really let something breathe through, and also the same versus having to do with sound effects, where I didn't have to be concerned about the sound effects. So also the stereo placement is different. So the mix, to be a good record mix, show very complete music. I really feel that that's my job, isn't to have someone else try to put the elements of music together in their head. That's one of the reasons I built this studio. Even when I'm doing an orchestra score, I mock things up in here, because I think that it's really too much to ask of someone's imagination for them to put all these layers of melody, accompaniment, rhythm, and the concept of how it's working with the characters and the moment in the film. So I get as close as I can before I show anything. I don't show stuff that's just like a little piece of it. Usually the first thing I'll do is test out the main title. And I put in that, I thought, a lot of what I thought the film was about in general. And in showing that to Jim, it's like a template. It's like saying, here is the vocabulary of the score. Here's what the percussion sounds like underneath. Here's the melody for when we need a melody. Here's the texture and the voices and the stringy type sounds. And here's sort of the whole thing. And then there might be cues later in the film where we can say, oh, let's use that signature percussion without the melody. you know, or let's use just the texture, just the ooh of the voices and take the rhythm out and the melody out, just to show as, here's my idea for the film. It's sort of like a production design. One of the things I'm very strong about, I do not listen to temp scores, because I feel a big part of what I'm brought on the film for is to come from this place in me that's very clean with the film, that has no history, no baggage. I wasn't on the set. I don't know that everyone was in a bad mood that day, so we don't feel good about that scene, even though the scene might be perfectly fine. I come fresh to the film, and the musical silence that exists in those first cuts are where I hear my ideas. So the minute I hear a temp score, my brain is polluted. No matter how much I try, everything is on some level in comparison. It's just a human characteristic to what I've heard before. Now with Jim, we've tried to sort of have the best of both worlds, because I came on the film early on T2, and the temp score was 90% my sketches for...
So a lot of work goes into the soundtrack that you never hear in the final mix. This movie was problematic because we knew that we could never hear everything that you would want to hear. You could never hear every sound that everything on screen would be making at once, because it would be too much. So you would have to choose what to hear at any given moment, and that choice is made by the director, you know, whatever dramatically you want to focus on at that moment. What makes it frustrating is that sound people, by definition, have to cover everything, because you never know. If you haven't covered that truck because you think the director is not going to want to hear it, the director will inevitably want to hear that truck. So our approach is to cover everything, keeping it separate enough that we can take out what we need to take out and emphasize what we need to emphasize. So you cover all that, and when you listen to it by itself, you listen to the effects premixes by themselves, you think this is great. But then you have to hear the dialogue and you have to hear the music, so the final mix tends to be taking things out, having everything, and then taking out what you don't want to hear, and you end up with the final mix. Sometimes when you've put all the elements together, you see what's missing, or you see what needs to be bigger, what needs to be different. If a sound effect isn't reading because it's at the same frequency as the music, for instance, and you take that out and you put a higher frequency sound effect in that might read against the music. There's technology now with digital editors, and I use a Synclavier, that allow you to call up sounds quickly, make interesting sounds quickly, and edit them against the picture quickly. I was always making these large sequences of additional sounds that were getting spun into the final mix. This was editing at the very last stage. So it's a good thing to put that little bit of spice in at the last minute, because you can trick people with sound, either by performing it heavier or recording it with some equalization. Sometimes we do a trick now where we actually speed up the film in Foley as we record it. So it's moving along faster. You perform the footsteps and then you play it at normal speed, and the footsteps are brought down, so they actually gain some weight that way. If you were ever to imagine, you see Arnold walking with his big leather boots, and then you would try to imagine this 5-foot, 90-pound woman. The T-1000 transformation sounds were the most bizarre sounds we had to come up with. Everything else had a real-life corollary. So I came up with a lot of bizarre ideas. Originally, I had these ideas that since he's metal, it would be these shrieking, singing, vocalish kind of metal movement. And I recorded a lot of stuff where you could take a string bow from a violin and you rub it against cymbals or pieces of metal. You get these very interesting sounds. And some of that is still in there when he's transforming into crowbars and spikes. But when I was first working on it, I had a whole variety of sounds possible. And we did a tie-line screening from San Francisco to LA. And Jim sat down in the theater in LA, and via the tie-line he was able to see a scene. We chose the scene where he comes off the tile in the front of the coffee machine, and I played my amazingly brilliant sound design string bow on various pieces of metal, and he said no. And we worked our way down to, I think it was a sound of putting your hand in cheese casserole, and that's what he liked. So I had a direction that he wanted. He didn't want high-tech, weird stuff. He just wanted goop. So that's when we started then recording interesting versions of goop. That's when we recorded dog food coming out of a can upside down as slowly as we could possibly get with that suction sound. We recorded blowing compressed air into a flour and water mixture and making these big bubbles. And we recorded it from inside the mixture by putting a condom on a microphone, putting it in the flour, and getting an interesting perspective. And it had this evolving metallic airy sound that you hear in the movie as the T-1000 is coming off the tile floor or lifting off the steel mill floor when he forms back into his body. We recorded a lot of stuff with a big vat of yogurt and a cup and just pounding the cup into the yogurt, and that became a lot of the bullet hits on the T-1000. So we went from my high-tech idea to...
You know, the marketing campaign, we took a strong position on that from the beginning. You know, came up with some of the iconography, the T2 idea. You know, just putting a kind of a symbol out there in the landscape and creating a kind of a sense of a myth even before the film came out. And one of the most difficult decisions in the early stages of generating a campaign were to reveal or not reveal that the Terminator was really the good guy of the piece. And this was a tricky thing because the audience might not accept it.
The danger was there, would this take away the steam a little bit? Would this be dangerous? Would people accept the fact that I am a good Terminator this time? Or do they want me to be mean and destroy in the first 3 minutes 4,000 people?
You know, we want to see him kill a bunch of people like he did the first time and be the badass.
And Jim's philosophy always is that you should cut the trailer in such a way that you don't give away the story and that you just give away a little bit of it. Then edit the trailer in such a way that people can't figure out what it really is in the end.
So we had to introduce the villain Terminator, the T-1000, and get that concept across. First, that there were two Terminators, and that this one was new and unique and absolutely terrifying. And then, right before the release of the film, reveal the concept that Arnold's Terminator character was the protector.
Even when we did the final trailer, you still saw me shooting, but you didn't know if I was killing anyone or not. So people felt like, oh, I was still the old Terminator. But then again, there was a scene in there where the kid was telling me what to do. So they thought, wait a minute, he's being directed by this kid. He's kind of the father image of this kid. He's the protector of the kid, so maybe he's the good guy. But in the next cut again, I was blasting away and all the police cars were flying through the air. So it was really cut together in a very smart way to really always confuse the audience and let them guess.
And by revealing the information sequentially, I think we sold the idea successfully.
And all of a sudden it created a kind of a buzz around the country and around the world. Kind of everyone was talking, do you think this is going to be, Arnold is going to be a good Terminator? We heard that he's going to be a good Terminator, but I've seen him in the trailer where he's blowing everything up again. What is it? So the buzz was created a few weeks before, not too far in advance, but a few weeks before the movie came out. So when the movie came out, everyone was interested in the story and everyone wanted to see it. And then when it, of course, opened up to $55-some million for the first weekend, everyone then wanted to become part of the event, not just the movie.
The off-the-shelf software we used was Alias, primarily for modeling. And we used Pixar RenderMan. And for the first time, we had written tons of proprietary code. So ASOC, Make Sticky, all that stuff. And that was essential to the production. Yet, it's very interesting. If you look at it, though, it was driven by the idea. We needed that stuff. We were posed an idea by Jim Cameron to do a Chrome Man. Okay, how are we going to build a man using bicubic patches? We've never done it before. No one's ever come to us with that task before. Well, if we do that, we essentially have to make him in different pieces. Well, if we make him in different pieces, we end up rotating him, he'll crack. Fine, we'll come up with a program to sew them back together every frame, no problem. Well, if that happens, then, you know, then we've got all these like 8-sided joints. That's okay, we'll write a separate program to give us C2 continuity across all these problems. So it ended up generating a lot of code that was usable. That has allowed other companies to actually think beyond their limitations because of the upfront examinations that we did. They've become part of the industry. And of course, you go back and then...
Well, the interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize about Terminator 2 is that the T-1000 was created by a mix of techniques. You know, from Stan Winston Studios, they created puppets and flexible metal figures that filled in a lot of the gaps in the computer graphics shots. The computer graphics shots are very expensive. So that was not a panacea technique to create this character. In the film, there's probably 42 computer graphic shots and 120 Stan Winston shots, but people just sort of thought, oh, it's a computer graphics character. So Stan's guys and Stan were kind of the unsung heroes of the film, because a lot of the credit went to the computer graphics team, but the character was created by a mix of techniques, which I really think is the right way to use all these tools, the right way to use computer graphics, at least in a photorealistic context, which is that you have to create a seamless blend of techniques. I mean, it's not high-tech versus low-tech, it's a continuum, it's a spectrum where, you know, I will use any available trick. And if one available trick is some tape and baling wire and whatever, some old trick that's been around for 50 years, I'll use that. And if the shot requires silicon graphics, you know, Onyx to process a bazillion bits of data and come up with an image that couldn't be created any other way, we'll use that. They're all just tools. The important thing is the image. You come up with the image. The trick to using multiple cameras is to actually get shots you can use that will cut, you know, between A and B camera, and it's still a good shot. And there are certain times when you just can't do it, when you have to work single camera. But if you're doing an action sequence, you have to shoot multiple camera, because often there's a limit to how many times you can restage a scene. Sometimes only, you know, sometimes you can only go once, so you've got to get it. And the trick is to get all the pieces of it and be able to light it in such a way that you're not seeing the lights, especially when you're starting to lay out 6 or 7 cameras for some big explosion or truck stunt or something.
I think when you're using music to express emotion, one of the things is the old standby, less is more. If the music's too busy or the audience feels you're telling them with the music what to feel, it's a big mistake. What I try to do with the music is say, pay attention, and then draw your own conclusion. The music is there as sort of a, you know, one of those marking pens when you're keeping notes, like, you know, where you mark things, you still see the printing through, but it just sort of, when you turn the page, you see that mark and it says, oh, that's an important sentence. The music can sort of come in on a film if it's transparent enough, like those pens, to let the real emotion come through, and just to tell the audience, you know, open your mind, open your heart, go into these characters, look what's happening. If the music crosses that line, the audience will actually retreat from what's happening because they feel over-manipulated. They want it in the action. They want to be pushed. If something jumps unexpectedly, that's sort of an acceptable roller coaster ride. They don't get mad at that. But if you take an emotional moment and you just try to say, feel sorry for this person, and you really gush with the music, or you do it in a way that is not in good taste, that crosses that line, people just go, you know, and they move away from it. I think that the idea of synthesized score is a little limited. I think that really it's film music, and there are very few pieces of film music nowadays that don't incorporate many different kinds of technology. Even some of the period orchestra scores that you hear and that I've been involved with, somewhere in there, beefing it up, sometimes you'll have a sustain that's created, you know, by a synthesizer, but it's orchestrated and composed in a way that it's appropriate for the film. I just think what's important is, in this time in history, we have, just from prehistoric rhythm instruments available to us through every period of music, all the way up to the future, we have it all available. And I think I was starting to grow on that film, so they had to give Linda like bigger boots so she'd look taller than me, because I'd started getting taller than her, so they had to give her platform boots. Well, the first scene we ever shot was the scene when we're fixing the car, and that was the last scene that I shot too, and that was a reshoot, and they had to dig a hole for me so I looked short enough. When we had to reshoot that, they had to dig a hole.
An audience never expects that the sound is coming from a different source than the visual. So that means, as a sound effects person, you can put a whole range of sounds into a movie, sync it up to an action, and people will tend to accept it. That gives you a great power. But, so therefore, the choice you make depends on the dramatic impact of the sound. So we try to choose a sound from all the many that are available that's doing the same thing dramatically as the visual is doing. Action films like Terminator 2 tend to have more replaced sound in the final soundtrack than other films. So I don't know what the percentage would be, but probably 50 or 60% of the dialogue from production has been replaced by ADR. And when that happens, you have to recreate the entire sound world from footsteps and leather jacket movement on up. It was a particularly hard job to get quality dialogue recorded on the set, and Lee Orloff did an amazing job given a lot of the restrictions that he was under.
We had an understanding about the way Jim makes his movies, and I know Jim makes his movies very rich and complex in a visual sense, and those often bring elements into the production that are in direct conflict with the sound mixer. In order to get those incredible images on the screen, you often have to create things, effects, and special rigs that just make lots of noise. Sometimes the locations are picked because of their incredible visual nature, but they're taken without regard to sound.
So the important thing in recording on the set, though, isn't recording the sound effects and the ambience. The important thing is to keep all that as quiet as you can to get the dialogue as clear as you can. So even when you have good production sound, you're not hearing all the other details. So even again, you have to build up the sound world with the footsteps and the cloth movement and the gun handling and the ambience.
In the case of Terminator 2, we were dealing with another factor, which was the Eddie Furlong factor, which was an unknown quantity in terms of it being his first theatrical outing. So we didn't know, first of all, before we started the show, what he was going to be like to work with on the set. More so, we didn't know whether or not, once he got a performance down, whether or not he would be able to recreate it in ADR or looping, as they refer to it. So there was really a strong sense that when Ed was on the screen, when the kid was there, basically do everything at all costs to keep it, because the spontaneity and all that, just in an untrained actor, might be impossible to get back again.
Our first attempt in dialogue in a movie is to use what was recorded on the set, because the performance on the set is almost always superior to what you can do in ADR after the fact. In some cases, we shoot ADR and we have it as a backup, and then we still, in this case Tom Johnson, the dialogue mixer, processed the production dialogue to clean it up as much as he could, and was able to. Sometimes he's not able to, and we have to go with the ADR. It's amazing to think that sometimes a line or a word of dialogue, the one word next to the other word, the one word is recorded 6 months before in a steel mill, and the one right after it is, many months later in a sound studio. And there you have problems matching sync, performance, and in the case of Eddie, the ADR was recorded many months after the production.
Problem we ran into was Ed was at that wonderful age where he was at the point where his voice changed. And so that was something else that we had to contend with. I mean, Jim and I were well aware that from the point of the show when we started in September until we wrapped in April, that his voice had changed completely. And in the middle of the film, it was cracking. So we not only started off higher, then went lower, but there were points when he would get excited, kind of halfway through the film, where his voice would crack. Now, these are things that, production mixer has to deal with. And so, regardless of the fact that there were shifts there, the shifts we could deal with in post-production because we could harmonize it, but we still were trying to, at all costs, keep Eddie's dialogue.
So as he's getting a deeper voice in ADR, Tom Johnson needed to pitch it up a little.
Well, the Skotek brothers have always been very good with large-scale miniatures and creating a sort of reality on that level, and traditionally have not been very involved in doing a lot of composite work, although they're comfortable doing it. They always prefer to try to do it a little bit more in camera, and I saw that as being sort of a large-scale miniature proposition where we build these buildings and cars and just blow them away with air mortars and that sort of thing. But then there were a certain number of shots in the sequence that were clearly going to be composite shots. And so they were really the perfect choice because they got to, once again, you know, run the full spectrum of technique from computer-generated imagery of the collapsing buildings and the shockwave propagating across the city to just good old-fashioned run the cameras.
We set about making this miniature. And the way we did it was we worked with several different scales. The front of this set were larger scale buildings that were in the range of a 16th scale, and as we went back further into the set we got down to a 35th of a scale. In all there were 6 or 7 buildings. You face the problem when you want to make a model that big of creating surfaces that have to support their own weight, and yet they have to be breakaway. One of the things that we saw very clearly from the nuclear blast footage of actual tests is that the concrete, the masonry, breaks up into millions of little pieces. So there's a heavy breaking. It isn't simply 2 or 3 breaks onto the surface. You have to disintegrate the matter. You have to practically vaporize it and blow it away. So we found a size that would work. We could create a kind of combination plaster and resin breakaway material that would support its own weight and yet be fragile enough that it would disintegrate when you'd hit it with air cannons and Ritter fans and that sort of thing. That was a major, major problem. We experimented with a lot of different things. We wound up taking plaster and mixing it in various densities to the point where you'd look at it and it would fall apart. Other times you'd hit it with a hammer and it'd break the hammer. It was a real crazy period of time because we're casting up these building facades and you would think, this is it, and we'd set it up and it would fall down before we'd shoot a test of it. And of course the guys on the crew were, you know, having to take tranquilizers because they're having to transport these breakaways from the platen where they were laid out and then put them vertical. And keeping in mind that when you have buildings, normally in a miniature where nothing happens, they're just used for an establishing shot or something's flying between them, you don't see the insides. Well, here we had this huge problem that we had to build the insides of these buildings at least in more than a perfunctory manner, if not in full detail, because when this blast comes, of course, they're ripping off the surface and then you want to keep ripping off the inside and pushing back deeper and deeper into the structure. So we found ourselves having to come up with materials for the insides of the building that could be mass-produced and assembled crudely but visually effectively and simply. So we experimented with, again, for these interiors, all kinds of things. We had cardboard boxes that were augmented with matzo crackers. We found that matzo crackers were in the right scale for rooms. They had the little segment lines so we could break them up and glue them in, and they were cheap. They were a ready solution. They were like having little plaster breakaway sections easily available. So that became an item on the set, matzo crackers. We had balsa wood chunks, metal chunks, plaster pieces. We also found that various types of cereals like shredded wheat and cornflakes were spray painted because, again, that looks like broken masonry. That was all spray painted down and poured into the rooms inside of these buildings. So when we had the blast, the matzo would shatter, the cardboard supports would shatter, the plaster supports around that would shatter, and then all these crackers and cereal would blow away and it would look like shattered masonry. So all that, those ideas stem from the notion of where can you find off-the-shelf detail. Facing across from the buildings, miniature buildings about 9 feet away, was a row of air cannons and several Ritters and E-fans. These were spread out along the length of the entire miniature, delivering the force to the buildings. It was a pretty lethal looking combination. It got to be pretty frightening looking at all these air cannons lined up with their cones, and some of these cones were filled with debris and metal shrapnel. We actually packed them with metal shrapnel as well to help disintegrate the building facades. We used 9 air cannons in total, 5 of which we had custom built for the film. These each were delivering like 200 pounds of pressure. We had also had 2 Ritters with louvers set up to augment those in between the air cannons, and several E-fans. The thing that was very interesting to see is that once this blast would go off, after we did our first take, we'd see if there were any gaps in that coverage of wall of air coming across the shot, a building or a piece wouldn't go. And the one thing we couldn't have in the shot was two buildings blow away and the middle one kind of gets a little shot. We needed an even wall of pressure to take everything out. That became, again, a huge problem of delivering a continuous solid wall of air into these models and then continuing that movement right on through the set and away and out of the frame. So we did quite a number of takes to achieve that. We found that very often we had two cannons aimed at a particular structure, and we'd find sometimes their own air currents would neutralize each other or bend the air around each other and leave a little section in the middle intact. So we had to do some experimenting to find out the best configuration of these cannons, and very often it was a matter of a ½ inch or an inch. Either way would make a big difference by the time that air got to the building. Even with all of that force, we found that these buildings would shatter and fall so far and then drop. The particles would drop. They wouldn't carry fully out of frame. So we found ourselves augmenting all of these air cannons, the Ritters, the E-fans, and airlines also, with upwards of 25 or 30 cables attached to the back of the set. These were wired into the structures that were holding up the breakaways. Those wires carried over to trapdoor drops that were weighted down with sandbags, and these were triggered by a computer. So what we had was on the fire cue or the blast cue, we had the air cannons go off, the Ritter louvers opened up, the airlines were triggered on, the E-fans were turned on, and at that same moment a computer tripped the drops on the sandbags, and all these wires also pulled the model apart internally to get this full disintegration and carry everything out of the shot. So it was quite a deal. It was like a giant machine. In addition to the breakaway miniature, we layered in several exposures of particles that were blown across the frame with an air cannon. These particles consisted of little bits and pieces, fuller's earth, some glitter, broken glass, that sort of thing. We also shot a miniature car that was matted into the shot, and several other elements of flying debris. We didn't actually use any fire in any of the shots. The scale would not have allowed us to put fire in those shots, and as it turned out, it's mostly flying debris. You don't actually see any fire occurring. We introduced a sense of fire coming up the surface of the buildings by tinting the smoke elements that we shot with a There are two other shots in the sequence, a street level sequence. One is of a freeway and an exit ramp with a bus that gets blown away, and another is of a park, kind of a park area where we have trees that get blown over. Those two shots had to be shot in a mirror, because as it turned out, we had built the sets in full, and we're in the process of shooting these elements when the live action portion of this sequence had begun. So we went up to the location where Jim was shooting the very first shot, which is the playground. The sequence begins on the playground, and because of the direction of the sun on that particular day, he approached us and he said, well, you know, it would work better if the sun was from the direction of lighting was from the right side of the picture and not the left. Can we key the rest of the sequence in this way? And we very nicely and politely said, oh yeah, we can do that. So we found ourselves, for the two existing sets that had been set up, shooting into a front surface mirror, and that made it a little more complicated, but we got through it. I'll say one of the things that we had to do shooting in the mirror for the freeway shot was to reverse all of the graphics, the freeway sign, the stop signs, the road signs. We also had to make the passenger side of the bus into a driver's side, rearrange the steering wheels on some of the cars and that sort of thing. So there were probably about 50 little details like that had to be modified for that shot. In the scene of the park, being blown away by the nuclear blast, we had very prominently in the foreground a stop sign. And this stop sign we had to make a mirrored image of. We laid it out in reverse, so when we shot in a front surface mirror, it was in the correct orientation. The reason we elected to shoot in a mirror was due to the fact that at that stage we were not planning on doing any opticals. We were not going to do any enhancements, and we felt if we could solve the problem on the set, then we would wind up with a better result. We felt we would have a purer, crisper image. As it turned out, most of those shots underwent further optical enhancement. So the kind of optical enhancements that occurred were after the fact changes. Jim wanted some fire on the trees, a little more smoke in the shot. What we discovered in going to opticals is that we got a grittier look, tougher and a more contrasty look, which is something we had talked about earlier on. We had discussed with Jim the possibility of degrading the image in some way, making it a little more contrasty, a little grittier. One, to affect the sense of the documentary footage, and two, to give it a slightly displaced quality that you would have in a nightmare. Those two qualities, I think, helped the sequence quite a bit. So the optical degradation actually worked in our favor. So we were in the city level street shots, no longer avoiding the use of opticals.
Sometimes you can kill a picture with sound design if you go too hyperbolic in stylizing it, but there's a certain degree of stylization that if it's done on a subliminal level can be very effective. We were working obviously with Gary Rydstrom's team up at Skywalker, and Gary had done a fabulous job on backdraft and giving a kind of personality to the fire and putting in a lot of animal noises and things like that into the flames, and that kind of approach where you're sort of doing what's obvious, but you're also working below that level on kind of subliminal messages that creates a weird energy or characterization to the scene, I think works very well. And then the rest of it is just about technical quality, keeping it as pristine as possible. The integration of sound effects and music is, I think, one of the hardest things in a big action picture. And Brad Fiedel, fortunately, had a lot of these things in mind, so he wrote music that wasn't overly embellished. It had a very strong percussion line. It had a strong melody line. There weren't a lot of counter melodies, and there was not a lot of Baroque detail that would get lost. He really went for a very visceral energy, which worked well with laying effects over it. But sometimes you just get into a big train wreck where you've got too much music and too much effects, and you have to decide on one or the other. And the other thing I believe strongly in is dynamic range. If everything is loud, eventually nothing is loud. So you really have to create those moments of quiet so that the loud stuff can have some impact without just being...
So maybe he's the good guy. But in the next cut again, I was blasting away and all the police cars were flying through the air. So it was really cut together in a very smart way to really always confuse the audience and let them guess.
And by revealing the information sequentially, I think we sold the idea successfully.
And all of a sudden he created a kind of a buzz around the country and around the world. Kind of everyone was talking, do you think this is going to be, Arnold is going to be a good Terminator? We heard that he's going to be a good Terminator, but I've seen him in the trailer where he's blowing everything up again. What is it? So the buzz was created a few weeks before, not too far in advance, but a few weeks before the movie came out. So when the movie came out, everyone was interested in the story and everyone wanted to see it. And then when it, of course, opened up to $55-some million for the first weekend, everyone then wanted to become part of the event. Not just the movie, but the event, this big giant that opened up in the summer.
The off-the-shelf software we used was Alias, primarily for modeling. And we used Pixar RenderMan. And for the first time, we had written tons of proprietary code. So ASOC, Make Sticky, all that stuff. And that was essential to the production. Yet, it's very interesting. If you look at it, though, it was driven by the idea. We needed that stuff. We were posed an idea by Jim Cameron to do a Chrome Man. Okay, how are we going to build a man using bicubic patches? We've never done it before. No one's ever come to us with that task before. Well, if we do that, we essentially have to make him in different pieces. Well, if we make him in different pieces, we end up rotating him, he'll crack. Fine, we'll come up with a program to sew them back together every frame, no problem. Well, if that happens, then then we've got all these like 8-sided joints. That's okay. We'll write a separate program to give us C2 continuity across all these problems. So it ended up generating a lot of code that was usable. That has allowed other companies to actually think beyond their limitations because of the upfront examinations that we did. They've become part of the industry. And of course, you go back and then, we were supplied with the idea, essentially. And it's always driven by the idea.
The trick to using multiple cameras is to actually get shots you can use that will cut, between A and B camera, and it's still a good shot. And there are certain times when you just can't do it, when you have to work single camera. But if you're doing an action sequence, you have to shoot multiple camera, because often we try to keep the set as safe as possible, given the fact that we're using firearms and that blanks in and of themselves can be quite dangerous, and we're doing a lot of simulated explosions and things like that. So, you have to work very closely with the prop man and the stunt coordinator and so on to make sure that what you're doing is safe at all times. And no matter how much you do things, there's always a new situation that you're not exactly sure what's going to happen. So often we'll step in. If we're having actors do things, we'll step in and I'll have a stuntman, wearing some face protection or whatever, do it and make sure that what we're doing is safe, and then we'll let the actors go in and do it. Because sometimes the irony is it's not so much the actors want to hang back and let somebody else do it. They want to get in there. They want to do it themselves, and often they'll bite off more than they can really chew. So sometimes
in T2, it seemed quite obvious which things we were going to be able to do practically. Obviously, since we were planning on blowing up a building, one mandate that we had was to find a building that would allow us to do that. And that almost just naturally precluded any place that was actually functioning, which meant that we had to build the interiors on stage. We first started scouting in the Los Angeles area, and we looked for exotic-looking buildings, anything that might look kind of futuristic or unusual. And although we did find a few candidates for that, all of them were occupied, and none of them were eager to have our film crew move in for weeks at a time and basically interfere with anything they might be doing for a living. So gradually we started expanding our field in terms of location scouting, and looked for industrial buildings that were maybe built to suit and that had not yet found occupants. And that led us to Silicon Valley. There was an enormous number of buildings up there that had lain empty. And we found a likely candidate, and then we proceeded to actually do construction inside a raw shell. It was completely open, just girder and cement construction, to build the lobby of Cyberdyne and then the second floor. And we removed the glass windows of the real place, replaced them with our own tempered glass, and that building was actually not 3 stories high.
We had a certain number of people that were dressed in SWAT clothing, and Mr. Cameron would come up and say, "How many guys would you use to do this?" We told him how we would do it, and then he knew what he had to see on film, and he came back to us and said, "This is what I have to see," and we took it from there and tried to place the people where it would be advantageous for the camera and still make it look tactically correct. Actually, we understand that they need to take license in film. And what we do is we help them take that license and make it look as believable as possible. People are more conscious now about the police than probably ever before. And they're well aware of how we act, how we dress, the type of weapons we carry, what we can do, what we can't do, what our cars look like. I mean, they see us on the news all the time. And when they see the police portrayed in a film and they don't look like they do on the news, then they go, "Hey, they wouldn't do that." So, and that's really what we do. We help the company make the policeman in the film, whether it's
There's a lot of different types of guns in the movie, and guns play an important role in the film, and Jim knows a lot about them, so I learned from him things like when a .45 was being press-checked in order to determine whether there was still a bullet in the chamber versus being cocked. Different sounds. Well, the basic rule is usually to make the gun bigger than it really is, so that the .45 pistols really are rifles. The rifles tend to be shotguns, the shotguns tend to be cannons. Everything is sort of 1 order of magnitude larger than it really is. In the case of the minigun, we had to go the other way because it sounded like a continuous tone, the real minigun, because it's so fast you don't articulate one bullet blast from the next. So we actually recorded the real minigun, and then I would slow the tape down so that you would hear a little bit more articulation of the gun. And then in the case of the minigun, I added a lot of thunder cracks to it, which I thought gave it a little bit more of an attack and gave it some space. The thing that I've learned about guns is that if you do a scientifically perfect recording of a gun in an acoustically dead space, it sounds like a firecracker, and it's not very interesting. What gives guns their character is always where you record them. So even if they're firing a gun in a shopping mall, we recorded the gun in a canyon, because that gives shape to...
Well, the stage 4, which consisted of post-SWAT shootout, that consisted of bullet hits to the neck, bullet hits to the face, and multiple bullet hits in areas of the face literally ripped apart with the steel under skull showing. Took 2 hours and 45 minutes to apply and about 45 minutes to take off. That's myself and Steve Laporte applying. And usually Steve would work on one side of the face, I'd work on the other, and we would do a little do-si-do type of thing, where I would work with one color, he would work with another, and I'd say, "You ready?" And we would switch, and he would jump over to the other side, and I would work on this side. And it really turned out to be quite a practical way to do it. And after the first few times we...
One of the things that caused me the most anxiety was the scene in which the bike goes out of the window at Cyberdyne, ostensibly with the T-1000 on the bike.
Originally, we wanted to do the stunt in the vertical, where we were going to actually turn the camera on the side and build a vertical set and shoot the motorcycle and ride on what's called a fan decelerator, which is the deceleration device where they'd be on cables. And that was one of Jim's considerations, and then we decided to do it at the live location.
For filmic reasons, for exterior shooting, we had to have the motorcycle come out of a second-story window. And if you understand about physics and you understand how an object falls, you realize that there is not enough time for a stuntman to actually react if you're only 2 stories up. Ideally, he should have been going out of at least a 3-story window to allow him to react.
We took a Kawasaki 650, built it into a police bike that looked like a 1000, so I had a weight difference there. The weight was much lighter, which I wanted. And I designed a ramp that we jumped the bike. Jim needed 35 feet of lateral motion on the motorcycle to superimpose the helicopter there.
We removed the glass windows of the real place, replaced them with our own tempered glass, put a charge on it so that the charge would blow and break the glass prior to the stuntman going through on the bike, so that he would not be in danger of being cut by the glass as he went through.
I had a cable attached to the stuntman's back at 18 feet in the air.
Because if he had just gone out of a second-story window on the bike and had not had any kind of safety harness to pull him back, he would have been falling at the same rate as the motorcycle, and it wouldn't have been a pretty picture.
We used a certain stress of cable. I used what's called a 3/16 7x19 cable, which is actually good for 12,000 pounds.
So basically, that cable or bungee cord pulled him back off the bike to allow the bike to fall free.
And I connected to what's called a deceleration ratchet, so he wouldn't just go to the end of the cable and get, leave his teeth chattering there. It's a real progressive pull that would take him off the bike, and at 35 feet, I figured that he'd fall about 16 feet back into a box catcher that we built below the camera line.
We'd set up a system of cardboard boxes, which everybody who's done stunts is kind of familiar with, a very old but effective method for providing a place for him to fall safely.
It was a real safe gag.
We use cyborg to digitize three-dimensional objects and get the representation into the computer. And one of the most powerful ways, or one of the most exciting ways to use it, is to get people's facial expressions into the computer. So we have a person sit in a chair, and the cyborg has a laser beam that rotates around the actor or actress, and by scanning in single lines, sort of like slicing an orange or something, we can reconstruct the actor's face. And you're very free to direct an actor any way you want. They can have expressions of sadness, happiness, fear. It's a very free process. You can sort of go with what's happening and digitize those expressions as you wish. And we can immediately work with them, animate, model, create human, very realistic, very strong human faces and heads.
It was quite something to go through. Going up there and starting to share with them what I was thinking and how I thought he should run and walk and how I wanted to carry him and how he would move. And then them filming it and actually putting the grids on me and spinning me around, and they painted that on me.
The dreaded helicopter mock-up. I mean, one of the most frustrating things for me, I think, was the helicopter sequence, because these are involve elaborate stunts and mechanical effects and special effects all sort of balled up into one, and any individual cut might be a second or 2 seconds long, but each one of those took a considerable amount of time to set up and shoot. And when we're trying to have the helicopter explode, which event took place on the Long Beach freeway during one of the nights that we had it closed down, we actually ended up reshooting that sequence 3 separate times because the helicopter just didn't blow up the way we wanted it to, or in one case.
Scoring an action sequence is an interesting challenge. There's no doubt about it that heavy rhythmic pumping music helps people understand that they should be excited. The problem is that if you do it for too long a time, you numb the audience. So you have this balance, as we have a balance in the emotional scenes between being supportive and sappy. You have the same balance in an action scene between enhancing and intensifying and numbing out the audience. Rhythm is very, very important, but what I like to do is plot an action sequence. Now in the Terminator films and in various other films, sometimes the action sequences are very long. I mean, it's not a big problem to score a minute of action because it's a burst of energy. But when you get into 5, 6, 7 minutes of action, which you have in the Terminator films, to me, I like to plot the whole thing and think of an emotional story behind a given action sequence. So I'll think, here this character is being threatened by what's happening. Here he's triumphing over what's happening. Here is really about get away, get away, get away. Here is about fight, fight, fight. You know, all these different, I call them beats, not meaning rhythm, but different sections with different emotional content. If I understand the action based on an emotional level, then the visceral level, that sheer adrenaline level, sort of takes care of itself because I will shift my rhythms. I will find different textures. You can't stay, or my opinion, and some people have in the past, just gung, 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 gung. That to me is part of, harking back to what a synthesizer score is, that's the bad part of what a synthesizer score is. Like you push a button, set a thing, and it just goes. I like to treat my stuff much more classically, even when I'm using very high-tech equipment, and that is to really look at the sections and look at what's happening. So if you'll really study, you'll notice that probably no more than 45 seconds or minutes goes by without a shift in the time signature, in the rhythm, in what percussion is being focused, in the texture or something. So if it's going dun 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 dun, it might shift all of a sudden. If you listen, you'll hear it. You won't notice it when you're watching it the first time. But if it went dun 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 right through the whole thing, after a while you wouldn't care much about the scene. But if it goes dun 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 dun, all of a sudden, whoa, something's changing. It's like the roller coaster. You're going up the roller coaster, and there's that moment, and boom.
Organic sounds, meaning sounds that we make as humans or animals make. It's a long tradition in sound effects to sweeten moments in the film with animal sounds and human sounds. Animal sounds are always fun, and there's a part in the film where they're being chased before they crash into the steel mill by the T-1000 in his semi, and they're in the little pickup truck, and the semi crashes into the back of the pickup truck. So there's a shot of the grill of the semi truck coming right up and hitting the back of the pickup, and Arnold loses hold of the gun and the grenade falls into the bed of the truck. And Jim wanted that to be a very scary moment, so we found a certain lion roar, and we added that to the sound of the truck itself to make it that much scarier. You don't hear it as a lion roar, you just hear it as something that maybe your primitive brain tells you is a scary sound. Also with the Harley, we actually snuck in some tiger sounds with some of the Harley revs just to give it some character. You know, that kind of stuff is always fun to do because it's...
The lighting was designed to emphasize the sort of coldness and sterility of that environment, and you know, we always came up with motifs that would work well for Arnold and for the character, and a lot of the stuff we did at the steel mill was a mixed light between orange and blue, which worked very well, especially when the Terminator was sort of half human and half metal. You know, we put the blue side there and the warm side there, and you know, it sort of got into that human and machine interface. And you know, Adam Greenberg had shot the first picture, so he was a natural to continue that look. And he had a certain look that he used on Linda, a certain look that he used on Arnold, and Adam lights outward from the characters.
What Jim was facing was creating the illusion that this was an up-and-running steel mill, when in fact it was nothing had happened there for years and years. There are several different approaches I suppose he could have taken. One was simply to address the art department, say, come up with something here. Here's a photograph of a real steel mill, and here's some tapes, and have a look at it, and throw a bunch of money at it and see what they would come up with in terms of creating glowing liquids, etc. The other approach is to maybe take a little bit of money and a little bit of time in advance and create that situation in miniature and manipulate it and try to solve those problems in a way that was handleable. Jim's approach on that was that he found that if you could demonstrate physically in miniature how this effect could work, you would solve all those problems in a desktop situation rather than going to a steel mill and spending a lot of time and a lot of money, lots of materials and hundreds of man hours. So Jim thought in terms of approaching a special effects company, namely ourselves, to do a microcosm of this steel mill and see what we could come up with to create the illusion of pouring molten metal. So what we did was made a small scale model. I think it was an 1/8 scale section of a generic steel mill with the kind of look you'd expect to see there, the kind of lighting levels you'd expect to see in a steel mill. We looked at some of the storyboards that already existed of what Jim was planning on doing to get a feel for what it would look like. Again, knowing that the relationship of brightness to the background was a factor and that sort of thing. So we created a ladle and a tun dish, and our initial approach was to bottom light the tun dish and fill it with a liquid that would conduct light up to the surface, which in this case was methicel. We set up the ladle above it, and we made a clear resin casting of the pour that went from the ladle into the tun dish, and had a custom neon rods set in behind that resin piece. And then what we did was to pour methicel down that resin spout with all this backlighting on it to create the illusion that this material was glowing internally. And that worked very well. What we were creating in miniature was a total mock-up of all the different techniques that would need to be employed by the art department. This mock-up was then done by the art department in full scale in a series of additional tests that we were involved with supervising or co-supervising with the art director and Adam Greenberg. And we were there involved with the placing of colored gels inside the tun dish to get the correct degree of sort of edge lighting on the glow. We'd have a hot center and kind of would taper off to yellow and orange around the edges to give this sense of thickness and mass to the metal. These large-scale tests that were done by the art department did prove satisfactory and were ultimately what were implemented at the full-size steel mill. Jim needed several additional cuts that were not possible to do on the set. These were related to the tun dish overflowing onto the floor. The art department effect was not meant to allow a liquid to free flow and create its own shapes in open space. That was overly complicated for the art department and very tricky to pull off on a full scale. What we wound up doing to create this effect was making a quarter scale section of the steel mill and filling it with a white liquid, which in this case consisted of, I believe it was Malox, white tempera, and some water. So there's this very peculiar concoction that we found ourselves mixing by gallons and gallons. But what we were looking for was a very white, thick liquid that would allow us to pull a mat. And what we needed to do there was to pull a mat and print back in a overexposed version of this white liquid through diffusion. So we would then wind up with this glowing sense of pouring material. What we then did after having shot that element, which was shot on VistaVision, we took a clip, the VistaVision clip, put it in our finder, and went over into another part of the stage where we had mocked up in full scale the tundish and part of the ladle in full size, but all in black, a very simplified version of it. We put a frame clip of our miniature in the finder and lined up our camera position relative to this mock-up so it matched the miniature perspective. And what we then did was add in our smoke and our spark effects full size. We had drilled this mock-up of the tundish and ladle with a lot of holes, and we fed in mole fog from underneath. And we had our deep sea welding torch rigged full scale, and we would tap that behind the dish. So we had essentially sparks and smoke against black done full scale, which were then optically combined with the miniature shot to give the sense of...
To get the effect of the frozen mercury in the film, to get it to melt as if it were actually melting mercury, the thought was that maybe we should just try freezing mercury and warming it to room temperature, and then it would flow the way it normally would. Practically possible, but not very practical to do this. The idea that we had thought of is to do a substitution for mercury, to use something possibly like solder that might melt in a similar way to mercury and look the same once it was melted. But it turned out solder doesn't quite work that well. It doesn't quite have enough sheen to it. So we had heard of a metal called cerabin. Cerabin is a very, very soft, very low melting temperature metal. It's almost like butter in a sense, not quite that extreme. And so what we did is we took some of the shards, some of the actual pieces that were used on the production, and made little molds of them out of clay, and melted the cerabin. We actually used a torch and melted it, and then poured it into these little molds. They cooled off fairly quickly, and then we bent back the clay and popped them out of the molds quite quickly. The clay was able to take the heat, and there wasn't any problem with the clay. We could make molds like crazy really quickly. And we wound up with little shards that were in scale for our purposes. They were about right. They were very tiny. And we photographed them with a macro lens. And we put it on a hot plate, essentially. We took a camping stove and put it underneath a metal plate and caused the heat to continuously rise under it to the point where it would melt it. And it would reach a point and it would start oozing a little bit like butter does in a frying pan. But in this case, it tended to go quite quickly and melted and flattened out. But it did seem to work right. We had to overcrank and shoot at the right frame rate. We wound up actually undercranking to get it's combinations of speeds again that work. A larger piece would melt at a different rate, we'd shoot at a different rate. A smaller piece would be at a different rate. And then we would take the best of. We had to shoot quite a few because, again, if the plate wasn't totally level, this would run off screen in the wrong direction. We'd have to bend the...
The glitching was meant to give some tiny ray of hope that it was possible to destroy this thing. It was possible to affect it in some way. They freeze it, they shatter it, and it reforms and comes after them again, but he's not working quite as well as he used to. That was an attempt to reiterate some of the beats at the end of the first movie where the Terminator gets run over by a truck and it kind of smashes up his leg and tears away some of the skin, and he's limping, and when he gets in the truck you see that his Terminator vision is glitching with static and he can't see quite as well. And it was the idea that just to give the audience enough hope that these characters, if they just kept running, if they just kept ahead of it, they might be able to get away. In a sense, to empower the idea that you just have to keep going. You just needed a little bit of hope to move on. Somehow, in the second film, in that sequence when it was all cut together, I didn't want that hope. I wanted it to be more hopeless. I'm not sure why. It was just a kind of a gut call. The shots of the glitching themselves are quite interesting visually. They're a little confusing, but they're interesting. But you lost momentum right there, and just this implacable, unstoppable thing coming after you, you know, and reaching a kind of a fever pitch at that point where they'd tried everything, and you thought it was going to work and it didn't. Then you're in that perfect state where the audience is just kind of...
The steel mill was real tricky. What we needed was a pouring facility, one, of which there are not that many actually in the United States to begin with, and some of those are functioning. Most of them are defunct because that technology is just changing, and those kinds of steel making processes are really done outside of this country. When we found the steel mill out in Fontana, we all knew that the mill was there. And we knew it was really one of our prime candidates. And once we actually got out there and started looking at it, it had these wonderful, great, you know, pouring, melting pots, and it seemed to have all the elements. There was a moment of real panic just a few weeks before we started shooting. All of a sudden, word came back from our location manager that the steel mill deal was going to fall apart. It was, at the time, owned by a consortium of Japanese and Brazilian and American investors, and they were trying to sell it to the Chinese. And the deal had been in the works for actually 4 years and had never really come to fruition. All of a sudden, the deal heated up. We get this phone call. No, you can't shoot in the steel mill because we're selling it to the Chinese and it's going to be disassembled and moved to mainland China. Small problem, you know, gee, let me just call Rio and talk to those guys and make them see it our way. It was real pandemonium. I mean, just everybody was coming unglued. This was our principal location and one that we knew was not easily going to be replaced. We started contacting every steel mill. I had my assistant on the phone for 3 days contacting every single steel mill in the United States. We called people, we got tapes, we sent people everywhere trying to find a backup. And meantime, you know, tap dancing and trying to talk to the owners of the steel mill. As it turned out, we were able to strike a deal with them that allowed us to shoot there, and with a proviso in the lease that if the sale should go through during the time that we were there, the Chinese would agree to allow us to complete.
It's a phenomenal amount of special effects that are required to turn that defunct steel mill into an active, blazing, hot inferno. Steam, the foggers, the sparkers, you know, and everything else that was going on where they're just crackling away and, you know, just missing actors by inches. Those things they're killer. They're death for you in terms of the production mixer. I mean, they're everywhere you turn around. You've got 90% humidity, so your microphone are being inundated with that. We're switching microphones out on, you know, a regular basis. You start listening, uh-oh, there go the highs, quick, pull it out, throw another one in. You can just feel the water on the diaphragm getting heavier and heavier. The transients are going. Pull it out, but you get another one in. So you're basically trying to keep track of those things and at the same time make a choice as to what the best way to get the stuff is. Man, you know, I just remember not only you're dealing with the steel mill, but you're dealing with Arnold, and Arnold in his 6 different stages of destruction. You know, you're dealing with breastplates. Where do you, if you're going to put a wireless microphone on an actor that's already wearing a chest piece and he's got, you know, things, you know, coming off him, and there's, at a certain point, it's very difficult to be able to have that microphone in a place where it's not covered up by a piece of body armor, a breastplate, or latex or anything that he's wearing, and still be able to get the track. I mean, we used a lot of radio mics there because of the Steadicam, because of the nature of the shot being big and wide, and the fact when the ambience is that high, you can't, unless you get a microphone right in direct proximity to the actor, your ambience is so high you're not ever going to get anything clean enough to use. So we tended to use a lot of wireless in the steel mill. You know, once we got in close enough, we would split tracks and give them the wireless on one mix and give them the boom mic on the other. And that's why I like using multi-track with Jim. Multi-track in the sense of a 2-track machine. It's one thing that's really useful, is that when you get there in the mix, you not only have the choice that we decided at the time was the right choice, but you give them an alternative as well. So they not only have the actors mic'd on the open mic, which they may be able to clean up. They may be able to pull some of the frequencies out of the foggers and the steam and still get a rich track out of the microphone, which, being bigger diaphragm, has a better response than a small microphone that you place on the chest of someone. You know, in a perfect world, we'd always go for the open microphone. In other situations, you have to go with the wireless, but I like to, when using the wireless, to, if I at all possible can, give them another alternative with the boom mic.
Stage 7 was him just completely ripped apart. The back of his skull was crushed in, all bloody and some steel showing. His face was ripped apart, the eye was missing, the light in the eye was glowing. Multiple bullet hits all the way around. His hands were ripped apart, his chest was torn open, he was limping, his knees were ripped apart. He was a real mess. And Stage 7 was a 5.5-hour application total. Arnold would come in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because we were shooting nights. We would work on him from 3 o'clock until 8:30 at night. He would go out to the set, and we would film until 6 in the morning. He would come back in the trailer once everybody left to go home, and we would spend the next hour taking it off, because you can't just rip that stuff off. It'll tear the skin up a little bit, microscopically, and day after day. Jim wanted to see an actual cigar put out on an actual chest. Well, Arnold's a man of steel, but he wouldn't go for that. So Steve Laporte and I came up with an idea of using a small, about the size of a silver dollar, aluminum plate with a little bit of Nomex fire cloth backing on it. We would take this and we would glue the Nomex face down onto his skin first, and then Steve designed a small appliance about this big around that would fit right over that, very, very thin and flat, with a small divot right in the center. In that divot, we took a little bit of wax, mortician's wax as we call it. It's actually used to recreate facial destruction for open casket funerals. And we mixed this with a little bit of red color, and we troweled that in there. You cover it up with some makeup. When the biker actually lit the cigar and burned it in there, it didn't burn Arnold a bit. And all of the sizzling and popping and embers and the burning of the wax.
When I first got the film, I was so excited because my schedule for the day was, okay, you go to school, then you have a little lunch, and then you go motorcycle riding, then you get to learn how to play with guns, and then you get to learn Spanish, and then your day's over. And it's just like, oh man, what a hectic schedule, you know? It was just like, it was like, what a cool schedule, and I only go to school for 3 hours in the day, you know? I'm like, all right, this is pretty rocking, man, you know? It's like learning how to ride a motorcycle did not seem like work. That was really cool, because while I'm motorcycle riding, I know I'm gonna go gun training after.
Another area of huge concern for me and for Jim is weapons, and obviously we're shooting with real guns in many of these scenes, and large numbers of them, and you're talking about, you know, a dozen or 15 people having a weapon in their hands. And you have to be very careful about how you control those situations. I'm a firm believer in always having somebody who is assigned to that job. And we worked with Stembridge a lot. Harry Liu and Sid Stembridge were really invaluable to us in terms of pulling together a wonderful array of weapons that would provide some of the fun and the excitement in the film, and providing a safe environment. The weapons are always under one person's care. That person is thoroughly familiar with firing techniques, can repair guns because they always misfire, and logs them in and out, and shows every person who's going to be handling a gun exactly how it is to be handled and what the protocol for handling a weapon is. In addition to that, Arnold's been in a lot of these films, so he's familiar with a lot of the guns, but Linda underwent a considerable amount of real weapons training, as did Eddie, so that we would make sure that they were familiar, not only so they could